Our discussant will be introduced by Tracy Gleason from Wellesley College.
We can turn this off, actually.
Our discussant for this afternoon is Dr. Jay Belsky. He is a professor of psychology at the Institute for the Study of Children, Families, and Social Issues in Birkbeck College in London. As you probably know, he is a founding and collaborating investigator on the NICHD study of early child care and youth development, as well as research director of the National Evaluation of Sure Start in the United Kingdom. His research, and there is a lot of it, focuses mostly on interpersonal processes within the family. And in deciding what to say about your research in this introduction, I decided it would be much quicker to talk about what you haven't done than what you have. And for a brief moment yesterday, I thought I had found something that you hadn't done, which is sibling relationships, but I double-checked, and sure enough, you've got some papers with Brenda Voling on that. So much for that. He has been instrumental, one might even say a pioneer, in encouraging those of us in developmental science to think about evolution and to incorporate an evolutionary framework into our thinking about development in general. So he's the perfect person to be our discussant this afternoon. Please welcome Dr. Jay Belsky.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. In fact, let me apologize in advance for those of you who look like you're going to give very interesting talks tomorrow, because I can't be here because I had a previous commitment to be in Cyprus 2 days from now, and it's very disappointing for me because I've enjoyed all the talks so far. So I thank the speakers, and I thank you for inviting me, Darsha. Now, the other thing Darsha did, which I couldn't really thank her for, was to make me the discussant when there were no pre-papers to discuss. So I had two choices. One was to kind of wing it and just take notes rapidly during the day and try to make a whole that had, make something that had some wholeness to it, or to do something else. So I decided to do something else because I could plan for that. Now, what I want to do is situate what I want to say in the perspective of what we've done so far. It seems to me that in considering sort of early experience, we've on the one hand described it. What's its nature, and not nature in the nature versus nurture, but nature in terms of its character. So we've heard about the first hour of life, we've heard about breastfeeding, sleeping, playing, mother-infant interaction, and most just now vitality dynamics and musicality. But we've also heard talks with regard to the determinants of early experience. So there was discussions of genes and hormones and hospital and government policies, as well as evolution. And there has been some talk, although in some respects not as much as I might have anticipated, on the developmental sequelae of early experience. And I think we got most of that last night, actually, in discussions of love and cooperation and violence and the like, as well as in Steve's discussion this morning. And it's really that, the sequelae of early experience, the developmental consequences of variation in early experience, that I want to organize my, quote, discussion comments around. And I want to begin by posing a question that I think we developmentalists veritably never ask. Because most of what we study are proximate mechanisms, and thus we address questions of how things happen. And that's why there's all this lovely work on various physiological processes. But we don't sufficiently ask the question, why should, if it should, early experience shape later development down the developmental road? I mean, many of us kind of were born with the early experience spoon in our mouth, myself included, and sort of never questioned where it came from. While I haven't agreed with them, I've always enjoyed the challenge posed by Jerry Kagan and Michael Lewis, who basically said, wait a minute here. You know, early experiences and a belief in the effects of early experience is a sociological and a cultural construction, although they didn't use that term because they weren't postmodernists. And Jerry nicely articulated this in his 1978 book, Infancy. And I think the field in many respects hasn't done enough to scratch its head and, address the issue of why should early experience make a difference? Wouldn't it make a lot more sense for nature to craft an organism whose functioning at point 3 was derivative of what was going on at point 3, or maybe point 2. And by the time we get to point 17 in time, whatever that represents, be it 15 years old, 20 years old, or 75 years old, why shouldn't that be driven by what's happening now or what happened yesterday? That's certainly Michael Lewis's claim. And I think we developmentalists have basically been born with the early spoon in our mouth, and we've just proceeded to say, can we find evidence of it, and how does it work, and so on and so forth. And I don't mean to cast aspersions on that work. I just mean to step back on it, because I think that's what an evolutionary perspective demands, addressing the why question. Now, Jack yesterday said we can't address why questions. We can think about them. We had a nice discussion of this last night, but we can't test them. I'm not so sure of that myself, kind of thing. But I want us to entertain the issue of why should early experience shape later development. And I think the answers come, interestingly, not from our field, but have come from evolutionary anthropologists. Nope, the wrong one. Who, and this is a piece by Pat Draper and Henry Harpending, published in 1982, about the effect of father absence on reproductive strategy. Well, in 1982 or 1990, well, by 1990, when I first ran into this work in the mid to late 1980s, I'd never heard of reproductive strategy. My guess is if you pick up any child development textbook, or you pick up 100 child development textbooks, and there are probably 100 out there, in developmental psychology, you will not find that word in more than 5% of them. I think that is an intellectual severe problem. Because one of the consequences of what we do is some of us study peer relations, and some of us study cooperation, and some of us study aggression, and some of us study, marital stability, and some of us study the quality of parenting. Well, from an evolutionary biological perspective, those things are not independent, separate operations, but they're part of something called a reproductive strategy. And to me, what was interesting about this paper was not the emphasis on father absence, but the introduction of a concept of a correlated suite of behaviors and developments that form a package, which is a package in the service of moving genes through time, from one generation to the next. And what I loved about this piece, and what got me thinking so much from it, was that it was really an evolutionary set of ideas of why early experience should affect later development. The early experience they were interested in father absence, they didn't define it early the way we might at this conference, the first hour of life, or the first year of life, or the first 2 or 3 years of life. But they were still trying to understand an experience had early in development and how it would relate to functioning later in development. But and Draper and Harpending argued that females raised in father-absent households show early expression of sexual interest and assumption of sexual activity, negative attitude toward males, and poor ability to establish long-term relationships with one male, which I'm labeling, and they labeled, a reproductive strategy outside the quotes here. Now, the truth is that what they offered was a new interpretation of some old established findings. I wouldn't call them facts because some of them are contested. And what's intriguing to me is that, and in fact, I had some problems when I first ran into this work, however much I found intriguing the concept of reproductive strategy, tying together development, mating, and parenting. And the first was, isn't this just old wine in a new bottle? In fact, the theoretical foundations of father absence research was Freudian theory. Freud argued that fathers is where our superego came from. Well, then some psychologists came along in the 40s and 50s, perhaps into the 60s as well, and said, well, we can test this hypothesis, but we can look at people without fathers. Now, of course, sexually promiscuous behavior was immoral behavior, so it was in that framework that the original work was done. So from my standpoint, whatever the intriguing characteristics of the concept of reproductive strategy was, it was just a reframing of something we already knew about. And the law of parsimony in science, as I understood it, said we embrace more simple rather than more complex explanations. So I couldn't find their fascinating, attractive, intriguing interpretation more parsimonious than either an attachment perspective, a social learning perspective, or for that matter, even a psychoanalytic perspective. Because to me, what they lacked were two fundamental things in their otherwise intriguing set of ideas introducing me to reproductive strategies. And that was first, that they didn't have a developmental mechanism. Okay, let's assume for the sake of argument that father absence is related to girls' sexual promiscuity. How? Through what mechanisms? Psychological, physiological, whatever. They didn't know, they didn't seem to care. Okay, but I think we do. The second was isn't a useful theory, in fact, isn't what defines a useful theory, that not only it can account for what we already know, but it can create new predictions, and therefore generate new research, and in consequence, if it has any legs, generate real discovery. So as far as I was concerned, as a paper introducing me to the concept of evolution of reproductive strategy, Draper and Harpending were wonderful. As far as convincing me, and certainly enabled me perhaps to convince others, it seemed to be a long way to go. And the last point was, to me, the biggest one, because what might be an original prediction that comes out of this way of thinking? And I struggled with this for months. And I have to say, I don't think I've ever pondered a problem as concretely. And I have to say, I've never come up, as far as I'm concerned, with his perhaps insightful and certainly fun prediction. And as soon as I had it, it was a eureka moment, one like I knew I'd never had before. I never had before, and I'd never have again, because it occurred to me what a reproductive strategy point of view led us to, as I'll show you in a minute, was a view that actually the kinds of things we psychologists and behavioral scientists look at will not only affect social behavior and emotions and psychological processes, but physical development as well. Now here we are, in 2010, and that may not be surprising. 20 years ago, I think it was, and we called it an uncanny prediction, because it led to this paper called Childhood Experience, Interpersonal Development, and Reproductive Strategy. We offered an evolutionary theory of socialization. And what I'm trying to do is frame what we're talking about here over these several days in terms of what's this early experience all about. I don't think it's about making people happy and healthy and loving and the kinds of things we in this room and hopefully in most of the world care about and value. I think it's about passing packages of genes through times and doing what it takes to do that. And most importantly, doing what has worked in the past, so we've evolved in order to do that. And so I advanced a notion, and most of this is very familiar, and even boring and tedious, which is the context of the family, let's say marital discord, high stress, inadequate financial resources, versus spousal harmony, adequate financial resources, influence rearing strategies, harsh, rejecting, insensitive, inconsistent care, sensitive, supportive, responsive, positively affectionate care, and thereby psychological behavioral development, insecure attachment, distrustful internal working models, what I call an opportunistic, interpersonal, advantage-taking orientation, versus secure attachment, trusting internal working model, reciprocally rewarding, mutually beneficial interpersonal orientation. And these, skipping a point, led to, over here, earlier sexual activity, short-term unstable pair bonds, limited parental investment, one reproductive strategy, not a bad one, but a different one. And over here, later sexual activity, long-term enduring pair bonds, and greater parental activities. Not a better reproductive strategy, although we might value it, in terms of passing, not a better one in terms necessarily of passing genes through time, but one that can do that too quite effectively depending on the developmental context and the broader ecology. And of course, one we very much value. Now you'll see what I've just said about family context, child rearing, psychological and behavioral development, and what I'm going to call reproductive strategy. There's nothing new here. We got plenty of theory and even mechanisms to talk about that. But what we predicted is, and this was the original prediction, is that in this process, we were going to affect somatic development. And what you had here, and this is what the reproductive strategy prediction and the emphasis on evolution by natural selection and passing genes through time emphasized, was here what we're going to get is earlier maturation, an earlier onset and completion of puberty, and here we're going to get a later maturation. Because what we have basically here is a fast and furious reproductive strategy. If the cues in your life are that the present is risky and precarious, as revealed to you by the quality of the immediate proximate environment you're getting, then to the extent your body can do it, it should speed up its development, get into the reproductive world as fast as it can, mate fast, and not invest heavily because you don't have much control over tomorrow, but at least you're breeding. Because if you wait too long, you could be dead. You can't win the evolutionary game by dying, unless you're helping kin in so doing. So even that has to be. Where over here, If the message you're getting from your environment, through your proximate environment of your family is, we love you, we care for you, the future is going to be benevolent, or benign at least, then you can take your time. Then you can embody all the social, economic, emotional, and cultural resources that proximate environment has to offer. There's no rush to get out there and breed. In fact, you're better off not rushing to get out and breed. Make yourself a higher quality mate who can transact business with the opposite sex and the same sex. You don't need as many sexual matings. You don't need as many pair bonds, and you don't need even as many kids to get those 4 or 6 or 8 great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, etc. Because you're growing up, or the anticipation is you're growing up in a future world. So the idea here is that in the family, we have a process by which the external risks that you're likely to encounter tomorrow, based upon the present and the past of your parents, are conveyed to you. That regulates not just your psychological development, as we're all familiar with and accept, but your physical development, and most important, your pubertal timing. Well, it's one thing to advance what I called at the time an uncanny prediction. It's quite another to see if it is substantiated. And here's a paper, so that was 1991. Here's a paper, a review paper, a brilliant review paper by Bruce Ellis, published in 2004 in Psych Bulletin, in which he makes draws the following conclusion. Psychosocial acceleration theory, is how he described our perspective, posits that warm, cohesive family environments slow down pubertal development, whereas dangerous or conflictual family environments accelerate it. Empirical research to date has provided reasonable, though incomplete, support for the theory. 1994. On the one hand, there is converging evidence from a number of methodologically sound studies that greater parent-child warmth and cohesion is associated with later pubertal development, as theorized. This research also suggests that greater frequency of parent-child interactions predict later puberty. On the other hand, the proposed accelerating effect of parent-child conflict and coercion on pubertal development is yet to be clearly established. So here are some recent studies since 1984 addressing that latter part, the accelerating effect of conflict on families. This comes from a study by Jane Costello and Adrian Rangold, the Smoky Mountains longitudinal study, and this is a paper in the context of alcohol use and abuse. But what they're going to look at is the effects of child maltreatment on pubertal timing, and I'm just going to jump down to this right here. The children in this study, if they were maltreated, completed pubertal development, Tanner stage 4, at 11 and a half years, the non-maltreated basically a half year later. So here we have an apparent effect. This is a field study. It's correlation, so acknowledged, in which we see, and this is in the first study to link maltreatment with earlier maturation. Okay, and that's... Okay, next piece of work by Bruce Ellis himself, who raised the issue in his elegant review piece that we don't have much evidence yet on the adverse environment side, as we might call it. Here are results from his longitudinal study, and what I want to really call attention to is the parental supportiveness here, because this is a measure, this is actually a composite measure called parental supportiveness, but also in there are elements of conflict. So this could be conceptualized as parental unsupportiveness and conflict and coercion, as well as warmth and support. And what we see here is that beyond mother's age of menarche, which is an attempt to control for heritability, and even beyond the anticipated effect of low social class, which is accelerated pubertal development, you get effects of family dynamics, marital conflict and depression, and parental supportiveness, or lack thereof. In the absence of parental supportiveness, you mature faster. In the presence, you mature more slowly. Excuse me for a second. This is all about girls. This is all females. You also get, separately, that more marital conflict and depression seem to increase BMI and thereby accelerate pubertal development. So here's a second longitudinal study. And the last one, or actually there are two more, comes from the previously mentioned NICHD study of child care and youth development, in which we were lucky enough to have NICHD invest heavily in physical assessments of the children in this family, in this study, starting at age 9.5 annually until they completed puberty. And here are just the results of that study, in which, presented in terms of the theory, in which we find that after controlling for mother's age of menarche, so this is a residualized age of menarche, an attempt to discount heritability, more maternal harshness at age 4.5 predicts earlier age of menarche, and that predicts more sexual risk-taking, basically more sexual activity, just as a reproductive strategy theory would predict. Intriguingly, While maternal harshness predict other risk-taking, alcohol, drugs, rock and roll, etc., that's not mediated in this sample through age of menarche, which kind of suggests that this is a real reproductive strategy pathway. Now, very recently, just last month in fact, this paper came out in which we asked ourselves, can we go earlier than 4.5 months in this study? In fact, can we link early attachment, which we know is not heritable, measured at 15 months, and we know from experimental work is causally influenced by the quality of care, the quality of sensitivity, the sensitivity. We know that causal influence not in this data set, but in other work. And can we predict pubertal development from that? So age 15 months, pubertal development, attachment security, predicting pubertal development, and it turns out, lo and behold, we can. That insecure children classified as insecure in the strained situation of 15 months are more likely, 65% here, than secure children, 54% here, to start puberty before 10.5 years of age. These girls have some breast bud development and or some pubic hair development. They also are more likely to complete their pubertal development, that is, both in terms of breast and pubic hair, earlier. Insecures, 43% before 13.5 years. Secures, 28% before 13.5 years. It's also the case, given these findings, you won't be surprised, that the insecures are more likely to both start earlier and complete earlier. And almost derivatively, they're more likely to have menarche earlier. So here we see 3 more studies suggesting that early development and the environmental influences on it seem to be shaping pubertal development in a way I would still argue that no prevailing psychological developmental theory can account for, except one that has an evolutionary reproductive strategy perspective. In fact, only such a theory would do what only a good theory does, which is point out new questions, lead to new research, and generate, in this case, what look like new discoveries. But having told you in some ways, at least initially, where I think I got it right, I want to tell you that in some ways I came to realize I think I got it wrong. And that's because, given that the future is inherently uncertain, should all organisms be equally susceptible to environmental influences? I mean, most of the discourse that we've heard, at least with regard to developmental sequelae, with the exception of Steve and the other work on gene-environment interaction, has more or less presumed that whatever we're talking about, be it breastfeeding or co-sleeping or nurturance or lack thereof, has the same effect developmentally on all members of the species. Well, to me, the more I thought about things from an evolutionary perspective, the more I came to realize that that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because it can lead, it would seem, to dead ends. The future's uncertain. So what if I get, as a parent, for example, not necessarily consciously, what I'm aiming for? What if I get my kid to study hard, to do well in school, to please adults, to be intellectually curious, and to get himself thereby, which is exactly what my parents said they wanted for me, a job where I could use my head instead of my body, where I wouldn't, like my father who ran a restaurant, have to stand on his feet all day. Well, you know what? Because the future's all uncertain, you don't always get what you want. My parents, it turns out, did. Here I am just jabbering away and getting paid for it, okay? But if you grew up in Cambodia in the 10, 20 years before the Khmer Rouge came to town, those good things, those things we value, being intellectually studious, being attentive, listening to your teachers, doing your homework, being achievement-oriented, they got you dead. Because the first people the Khmer Rouge murdered were people like those in this room. No calloused hands, no callus on the hands, and or wearing spectacles. Khmer Rouge were behavioral scientists. They went for indicator variables. You know, they said those are markers of education. The future's uncertain. What you think you want may turn out what you don't want. So from that standpoint, that led me to advance the proposition that we should have our conditional alternative reproductive strategies. Conditional strategies and conditional strategists are like what I've been talking about, which is, and like what most of us have been talking about, which is environmentally regulated development. Early experiences, depending on how you define early, I'll leave it to you, will shape timing of puberty, sexual behavior, pair bonding, parental investment, and therefore your progeny's, quote, well-being and reproductive success themselves. But since the future's uncertain, we also should have alternative strategists who go the fast way or the slow way, or the middle way, which is neither fast or slow, let's say, irrespective of their environmental influences. And that doesn't ring false in many respects. I mean, we've all heard about psychopaths who come out of what seem like perfectly good families. And we've made a field out of something called resilience, which I think is actually problematical, which is children who seem to do well no matter that they grew up in the worst of possible circumstances. Well, I want to suggest that those aren't necessarily resilient kids, but they may simply be fixed strategists. They're following alternative strategy development. Environmental experiences, for the most part, is water off a duck's back for them, where for the conditional strategist, it's the opposite. And while I've written a couple of review papers on this, published last year in Molecular Psychiatry and in Psychological Bulletin, which you can all access, and it'll make the case for this, what I call differential susceptibility hypothesis, and what Boyce and Ellis, coming to the same point of view, call biological sensitivity to context, also from an evolutionary perspective, but intriguingly a somewhat different one. Instead of going through all that work, we don't have the time, what I want to share for you is, to me, one of the most exciting pieces of data I've seen in my career, and that's probably because it provided evidence of just this. Because this is a test of the conditional versus alternative reproductive strategy hypothesis by looking at a G by E interaction done by Steve Manick at the University of Pittsburgh, in which he selected carefully 2 estrogen receptor genes, and he crossed them with family history. And what did he discover? He discovered that in this one of the two genotypes interacted with early family environment. Families range from high conflict, low cohesion, to low conflict, high cohesion, i.e. seemingly good families, seemingly bad families. And he was predicting age of menarche. And as you can see, for those with the dashed line who carried these 2 genotypes, they look like fixed strategists. Whether they grew up in the worst possible families he could measure, at least in his sample, and this is about a sample of like 400 women, or high conflict, low cohesion, it didn't matter. It was water off a duck's back. But for these guys, I should say gals, it made exactly the difference that the psychosocial acceleration theory predicted. Namely, that under conditions of high conflict and low cohesion, go to seed early, mature fast, be a speedy developer, because life is risky and precarious, and who knows if I'll be there tomorrow, so 1 in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. We're here, in a nice, comfortable environment, no rush to go to seed. A bird in the hand is not worth 2 in the bush. Wait and give it time. So what I want to leave you with, before just making one other conclusion, is the fact that I think we need to ask ourselves, why do we think early experience should be shaping later development? And in the service of what goals? And I think because so much of this work has been funded, not as much as some of us might like, by the National Institute of Mental Health, which really has spent most of its time studying mental illness. That because so much of this work is carried out in the service, and the humanitarian service of understanding the dire effects of adversity, the nature of disturbances in development, that we think that the goal of life is to be happy, is to be free of too much aggression, is to mate carefully and be happily married and to have long, stable pair bonds. Well, I don't think nature, carries those values necessarily. And I think nature values what works. And under some ecological conditions, one works. Under some ecological conditions, the other tendency works. And because the future's uncertain, we're not all going to be equally malleable. In the same way, what's the core basic principle of financial investment theory? The first thing you should learn as a financial investor, well, maybe the second. The first thing is don't invest it if you can't afford to lose it. Or maybe the first is don't invest it if you don't have it. Okay, so we'll call this the third principle of financial investing, and that is diversification. So having some who are malleable and developing according to circumstance and environment, and some who are fixed, is really a diversified investment. It should be maximizing the dispersion of genes in future generations in the same way that a mixed portfolio should, except for credit crunches, maximize return on financial investment. Now, one of the interesting things that emerges here is, and I've never understood population genetics until I started thinking about this problem, is should we presume that every population has an equal percentage of more and less malleable people? We shouldn't. So maybe we do and don't find G by E interactions, or we do and don't find environmental effects, because we're talking about different populations and different ecologies. I think one of the things developmental psychologists know nothing about and need to know much more about is that field of evolutionary biology called behavioral ecology. It's an environmental discipline, but it's environmental discipline that's informed by the theory of natural selection. It's not an environmental discipline informed by a Western values theory of mental health. And that's why I think it's got it more right than the latter does. Now, let me just conclude by raising the issue of mechanism because it gets to issues of epigeneticists. By what physiological mechanisms might rearing experience, including insecurity-inducing insensitive mothering and maternal harsh control, come to regulate biological development and thereby reproductive strategy? Well, back in 1991, we speculated that a neuroendocrine subsystem intertwined with other endocrine systems could provide a pathway linking experience in the family with pubertal timing. We were pretty vague about it, but we knew there had to be something going on underneath the skin. Well, in 2005, Jim Chisholm, an evolutionary anthropologist, and his associates theorized that the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, in particular, which is directly involved in stress regulation, may play a critical role in the process. Recent elegant experimental research, in fact, this work is so elegant, I like to talk about it as the 22nd century science research in the 21st century. Recent elegant experimental research with rats by Cameron and Associates showed not only that maternal licking and grooming of the newborn pup enhances stress regulation, delays the onset of puberty, and reduces sexual activity. We're talking reproductive strategy here, folks. With the reverse being true of its absence, but that such effects on rat reproductive strategy are mediated by maternal care effects on gene expression via methylation. In other words, the maternal care effects that Meany documents showing that methylation is affecting stress regulation is not about the mental health and good mothering. It's about regulating reproductive strategies in the service of fitness outcomes in what was no doubt the rat CEA and probably our own as well. And in fact, I was fascinated and sort of 3 years ago when Michael Meany gave a talk at the Child Development Conference meetings, and he started by putting up that first slide, a slide I showed you with the evolutionary theory of socialization, because he was saying all of this work showing that maternal licking and grooming, quality of parental care, parental investment, affecting gene expression, affecting stress regulation, affecting sexual behavior, affecting parenting, passing on into generation and next generation, is part of reproductive strategy regulation. And so, again, I suggest to you that you entertain, questions about why should there be early experience effects, and you cast those answers not just in behavior and mental health terms, but in fitness, dispersion of genes in future generation terms, not because that framework obviates the other perspectives, because I think what it does is it breathes new meaning into them and often shows us that our understandings are correct, but for reasons we haven't even begun to imagine. Thank you very much.